In a quiet southern town where the moss hung low from ancient oak trees and time seemed to move a little slower, old wounds from a painful past still lingered in the shadows. Despite the town's picturesque charm, a heavy undercurrent of racism and inequality ran deep beneath its surface, just as it had for generations. And at the very heart of this town's justice system presided Judge Franklin D. Mercer, a name that sent a chill down the spines of many who walked into his courtroom. Judge Mercer was a man who wore his power like armor. Tall, broad-shouldered, with icy blue eyes that showed no trace of compassion, he embodied the old world, one that had resisted change with every fiber of its being. To many, he was a relic of an era that should have ended long ago. But inside his courtroom, he reigned supreme. His word was law, and his law was harshest on those who shared no resemblance to him. Franklin Mercer was known for handing down the severe sentences, often without just cause. If you were Black or Latino, your fate was usually sealed the moment you stepped before him. Evidence? Reason? Justice? Those were mere formalities to a man like Mercer. To him, justice was a tool to maintain control, and mercy was a weakness he couldn't afford. But life has a curious way of humbling the arrogant. The case of Alina Monroe. One sweltering summer afternoon, the courtroom was unusually crowded. People had gathered to witness yet another trial. This time, that of Alina Monroe, a young Black woman barely 24 years old. Alina had grown up in this very town, raised by her grandmother after losing her parents to a car accident when she was just a child. She was bright, determined, and filled with dreams of one day becoming a lawyer herself. She had graduated top of her class from a nearby university and had been studying tirelessly for the LSAT. But all those dreams hung by a thread that day as she stood, shackled, before Judge Mercer. Alina was accused of stealing from a local electronics store. The evidence against her was flimsy at best, a blurry security tape and the word of a store clerk with a known history of racial prejudice. Several witnesses had vouched for Alina's whereabouts at the time of the alleged theft, but in Judge Mercer's courtroom, facts were often inconvenient details to be swept aside. As she stood there, her hands trembling slightly but her chin held high, Judge Mercer studied her with that cold, calculating stare. Then, without hesitation, he spoke. "You look guilty enough to me," he said, his voice devoid of empathy. "I sentence you to 10 years in state prison." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Alina's grandmother sobbed quietly in the back row. Alina herself felt the world blur as tears welled in her eyes. But she didn't plead. She didn't beg. She stood tall, even as her heart shattered inside her chest. No one dared to oppose Judge Mercer. His power was absolute, or so he thought. Entered Daniel Whitmore. Just a few days after the sentencing, an unexpected visitor arrived at Judge Mercer's office. Daniel Whitmore was a name that commanded attention far beyond the borders of the little town. A billionaire philanthropist, Daniel was known not only for his wealth, but for his fierce advocacy for social justice. He had funded numerous legal aid organizations and was a vocal critic of systemic racism. Many admired him, others feared him. Daniel entered Mercer's office with a quiet confidence, his tailored suit contrasting sharply with the dark, wood-paneled room that smelled of old leather and older prejudices. He sat across from Mercer, a faint, knowing smile playing at his lips. "Judge Mercer," Daniel began, his voice smooth yet firm. "I've been following your work for some time." Mercer bristled. "Have you now? Well, I do uphold the law." Daniel's smile widened slightly. "That's one way to put it. What brings you here, Mr. Whitmore?" "I'm a busy man. I'll get straight to the point," Daniel said, leaning in slightly. "I have a proposition. A game, if you will." Mercer raised an eyebrow. "A game." Daniel nodded. "Play this game with me, and I'll give you $10 million. No tricks, no strings. Just one simple condition." Mercer laughed, a deep, hollow sound. $10 million? What's the catch? "You spend just one day in prison," Daniel said. "Under the exact same conditions you sentenced Alina Monroe to." The judge's laughter stopped abruptly. "One day," he said skeptically. Daniel nodded. One day, Mercer considered it. $10 million was no small sum. One day in prison seemed like an easy bargain for that kind of payout. He was confident he could handle it. After all, how bad could it be? You have yourself a deal, Mercer said, shaking Daniel's hand with a smug grin. He had no idea what he had just agreed to. A day that changed everything. The following morning, Judge Franklin Mercer arrived at the state prison, expecting a symbolic gesture, perhaps some minor inconvenience, a few hours in a cell before being released. But the moment he stepped inside, his world turned upside down. The guards stripped him of his clothes, his dignity, and his identity. He was no longer Judge Mercer. He was inmate number 52176. They dressed him in the same orange jumpsuit he had seen on so many others. His personal belongings, watch, wallet, even his wedding ring, were locked away. He was led through the prison, past inmates who immediately recognized him. Whispers turned to jeers. Jeers turned to threats. Well, one inmate sneered. Look who's finally on our side of the bars. Mercer tried to assert his authority. You will respect me. I'm a judge. But no one listened. Not the guards. Not the inmates. He was shoved hard into his cell, his protests ignored. As the hours dragged on, Mercer experienced a life he had only ever seen from behind his bench. Only now he was on the receiving end. The meals were cold and tasteless. The guards barked orders with contempt. The prisoners, many of whom had stood before him years earlier, delighted in his discomfort. Some made crude jokes. Others whispered threats. One even spat in his face. And Mercer could do nothing. By nightfall, fear settled deep into his bones. He lay on a thin, stained mattress, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Every sound made him flinch. He thought about Alina Monroe, about all the men and women he had sentenced without compassion, without justice. Help me, he had whispered to a passing guard at one point. The guard smirked. Funny how that works, ain't it? Redemption. When the 24 hours ended, Mercer was released. But he was no longer the same man. Something inside him had broken. Or perhaps something had finally healed. The next morning, Judge Franklin Mercer reopened the case of Alina Monroe. The courtroom was packed once again, but this time the atmosphere was different. He sat quietly for a long moment before speaking. Miss Monroe, he said, his voice unsteady, I was wrong. You were wrongfully convicted. You deserve justice. And with that, he overturned her conviction. The chains were removed from her wrists. Alina stepped forward, her eyes locking with his. Sometimes, she said quietly, you have to walk in someone else's shoes to understand their pain. A single tear rolled down Mercer's cheek. For the first time in his life, he truly understood. What goes around comes around. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the town, then beyond. Judge Mercer resigned from his post shortly afterward and dedicated the rest of his life to working with legal aid societies, helping those he had once condemned. Alina Monroe went on to become a respected defense attorney, her name synonymous with courage and perseverance. And Daniel Whitmore? He simply smiled. He had seen enough times how justice, in its purest form, always finds a way. This story teaches us a powerful truth. What goes around comes around. Power and privilege can blind a person, but justice has a way of making things right. If this story moved you, share it with others. Leave a comment below. What does justice mean to you?